What if I told you that one of the most influential thinkers in history lost his mind before the world realized his genius? What if I told you that his ideas were so powerful, so radical, that they terrified his own era and reshaped the world after his death? Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who declared, "God is dead," the man who envisioned the Übermensch, who warned us about the dangers of slave morality, herd mentality, and the collapse of meaning, was dismissed as a madman before his work became the foundation of modern existentialism, psychology, and postmodern thought. But what if we've misunderstood him all along? What if the true Nietzsche, the one who challenged everything, questioned all truths, and forced us to confront our deepest fears, has been hidden behind a wall of misinterpretations, distortions, and ideological hijackings? His name has been twisted, misused, and falsely linked to some of history's darkest moments. Yet, in our world today, where people are more disconnected, uncertain, and lost than ever, his philosophy might just be the most important and relevant thing we have. Nietzsche did not give us comforting answers. He did not offer a path to salvation. Instead, he gave us a challenge. Are you strong enough to create your own values? To reject the illusions fed to you by society, religion, and ideology? To embrace the terrifying reality that life has no inherent meaning unless you create it yourself? This is the Nietzsche they don't want you to know. The Nietzsche who does not fit neatly into any political ideology, who does not bow to dogma, who does not comfort the weak, but instead forces them to overcome themselves. If you think you understand Nietzsche, think again. By the end of this video, you will see why his philosophy was not just dangerous to his time, it is still dangerous today. And before we dive into the most mind-blowing, controversial, and brutally honest philosophy ever written, take a second to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future deep dives into philosophy, psychology, and the most dangerous ideas in history. And if you love content like this, consider dropping a super thanks or supporting us through a donation, because keeping real intellectual discussions alive on YouTube is more important than ever. Now, prepare yourself, because once you step into Nietzsche's world, there's no going back. Friedrich Nietzsche remains one of the most polarizing and misunderstood figures in the history of philosophy. To some, he was a visionary, a thinker who shattered old beliefs and paved the way for existentialism, postmodernism, and psychological analysis of human behavior. To others, he was a dangerous provocateur, a madman whose radical ideas undermined morality and fueled destructive ideologies. Even today, Nietzsche's name sparks heated debates, and his works are dissected from vastly different angles. Was he a genius, or simply someone who pushed his mind beyond its limits until it collapsed? Understanding Nietzsche requires delving into his personal life, his intellectual battles, and the way his ideas were distorted long after his death. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Aachen, Prussia, into a deeply religious family. His father was a Lutheran minister, and there was an expectation that young Friedrich would follow in his footsteps. But tragedy struck early. His father died when Nietzsche was only 5, followed by the death of his younger brother soon after. These losses had a profound effect on him, shaping his views on suffering, fate, and the fragility of human life. Despite excelling academically and showing early promise in classical studies and philology, Nietzsche's life was marked by physical ailments and deep personal struggles. He suffered from chronic headaches, nausea, and deteriorating vision, which contributed to a sense of alienation from others. Though he achieved academic success, becoming a professor at an unusually young age, he would later abandon his teaching career, choosing instead to live as an isolated wanderer, moving from place to place in search of better health and intellectual clarity. Nietzsche's rebellion against traditional philosophy was both radical and deeply personal. Unlike many thinkers before him, he did not merely critique systems of thought, he sought to dismantle them completely. He saw Western civilization as being in decline, weighed down by outdated religious morality and philosophical constructs that discouraged individuality and personal greatness. His most famous declaration, "God is dead," was not meant to be a simple attack on religion, but rather a recognition of the fact that belief in a divine moral order was eroding. He observed that modernity, with its growing reliance on science and rationality, was making traditional religious faith unsustainable. Yet, rather than celebrate this as progress, he warned that the death of God would leave a dangerous void, one that could lead to nihilism, where people find life meaningless and directionless. This critique of morality extended to Christianity, which Nietzsche saw as a system that promoted weakness and submission rather than strength and vitality. He argued that Christian morality, with its emphasis on humility, meekness, and self-sacrifice, was a slave morality, a morality developed by the weak to protect themselves from the strong. He believed that Christianity's promise of an afterlife discouraged people from fully engaging with the reality of life, making them passive and fearful. Instead, he championed the idea of life affirmation, where individuals should embrace their instincts, desires, and potential for greatness without being constrained by guilt or fear of divine punishment. Nietzsche's ideas were deeply controversial in his time, and they remain so today. His rejection of traditional morality led to accusations that he was advocating for amorality or even cruelty. However, this is a misunderstanding. Nietzsche was not promoting a world of chaos where people act without consequence. Rather, he was urging individuals to take full responsibility for their existence, to create their own values rather than blindly following imposed ones. He admired figures who embodied strength, creativity, and a willingness to challenge the status quo, such as Napoleon or Goethe. He saw these individuals as models of the Übermensch or Overman, a concept that represented those who rise above conventional morality to shape their own destiny. The biggest and most tragic misinterpretation of Nietzsche's work came decades after his death, when the Nazi regime twisted his writings to justify their ideology. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch was misused to support ideas of racial superiority. Even though Nietzsche himself detested nationalism and anti-Semitism, his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, played a key role in this distortion. After Nietzsche's mental breakdown in 1889, she took control of his unpublished works, editing and altering them in ways that aligned with her own far-right beliefs. By selectively curating his writings, she made it appear as though Nietzsche supported German nationalism and Aryan supremacy, despite the fact that he had explicitly criticized both. This manipulation of his ideas contributed to the widespread misconception that Nietzsche's philosophy was aligned with fascism, when in reality, he was deeply critical of authoritarianism in any form. Even beyond the Nazi misinterpretation, Nietzsche's work has often been misunderstood because of its provocative style and complex ideas. Unlike many philosophers who sought to construct detailed, systematic theories, Nietzsche's writings are fragmented, poetic, and filled with aphorisms that challenge the reader rather than providing clear conclusions. His work demands active engagement, forcing individuals to grapple with their own assumptions and beliefs rather than passively absorbing doctrines. This is part of what makes him so influential, but it also makes his work prone to misinterpretation. Today, Nietzsche's relevance is stronger than ever. His critiques of morality, religion, and culture resonate in a world where traditional belief systems are eroding, leaving many people searching for meaning. His warnings about nihilism seem eerily prescient in an age where depression, anxiety, and existential uncertainty are widespread. At the same time, his ideas about self-overcoming, personal responsibility, and the pursuit of greatness inspire those who seek to carve their own path rather than conform to societal expectations. Figures in business, art, and philosophy continue to draw from Nietzsche's insights, whether consciously or not. The hustle culture mentality, for example, echoes elements of his will to power, where individuals push themselves beyond their limits to achieve success. However, his work also serves as a warning without careful interpretation. His ideas can lead to dangerous extremes, either by falling into ruthless individualism or by descending into despair. Nietzsche's life itself serves as a cautionary tale. He was a man who pushed his intellect to its limits, constantly challenging himself and others. But his isolation, health struggles, and intense philosophical pursuit may have contributed to his eventual collapse. In 1889, He suffered a mental breakdown and spent the last decade of his life in a vegetative state, unable to write or communicate coherently. The exact cause of his condition remains debated. Some suggest syphilis, while others believe it was a neurological disorder or the psychological toll of his extreme intellectual endeavors. Whatever the reason, his decline adds another layer of tragedy to his legacy. Ultimately, Nietzsche's ideas continue to shape how we think about power, morality, and the meaning of life. Whether seen as a prophet of existentialism, a critic of modernity, or a dangerous radical, his work refuses to be ignored. His legacy is one of challenge. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, question long-held beliefs, and rethink what it means to live authentically. While he himself may have met a tragic end, his philosophy remains alive, continuously provoking and inspiring new generations to engage with the deepest questions of human existence. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is one of the most debated and misunderstood ideas in philosophy. Unlike traditional philosophical systems that attempt to define life in terms of reason, morality, or divine purpose, Nietzsche saw life as fundamentally driven by a raw, underlying force, a constant striving for power, growth, and self-overcoming. The will to power is not just about domination in the political or social sense, but about the deeper existential force that compels individuals, societies, and even life itself to evolve, expand, and assert itself over obstacles. It is the drive behind ambition, creativity, innovation, and personal transformation. More than any other idea, it represents Nietzsche's rejection of passive existence and his challenge to conventional views of morality, religion, and human nature. Traditional moral systems, particularly those shaped by Christianity, have long promoted humility, self-sacrifice, and submission as virtues. Nietzsche saw this as an artificial restraint imposed on humanity, designed to keep people weak, obedient, and fearful of their own potential. He argued that morality was not an objective truth, but a construct created by those who lacked the strength to assert their own will to power. This is where Nietzsche's famous distinction between master morality and slave morality comes into play. Master morality, according to Nietzsche, arises from the strong, those who embrace their instincts, take risks, and create their own values. It is based on qualities like strength, courage, ambition, and a willingness to take responsibility for one's own existence. Slave morality, on the other hand, is the morality of the weak, those who, unable to assert themselves, instead create moral systems that glorify passivity, meekness, and obedience. Christianity, in Nietzsche's view, epitomized this slave morality by turning suffering into virtue and encouraging people to wait for rewards in the afterlife instead of asserting themselves in the present. This critique of morality also extended to Nietzsche's view of scientific determinism. In his time, many thinkers, influenced by Darwinism and mechanistic materialism, believed that human behavior was entirely governed by biology and external conditions. Nietzsche, however, rejected the idea that people were merely the products of their environment or genetic makeup. The will to power, in his view, was a fundamental force that allowed individuals to break free from deterministic constraints and shape their own destinies. It was an argument for radical self-determination, a belief that human beings are not simply bound by their circumstances, but have the ability to transcend them through sheer force of will. This is why Nietzsche was so opposed to doctrines that preached resignation, whether in the form of religious faith or scientific fatalism. He saw both as excuses for weakness, as ways for people to avoid taking responsibility for their own growth. In real life, the will to power can be seen in those individuals who refuse to accept limits, who challenge norms, and who transform the world around them through their ambition and vision. Figures like Napoleon Bonaparte embody this force, someone who rose from obscurity to reshape Europe through sheer strategic brilliance and relentless ambition. Napoleon did not accept the social order he was born into. He created his own reality through military genius and political maneuvering. Similarly, in the modern age, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk represent different manifestations of the will to power. Jobs, despite being ousted from Apple, refused to surrender. eventually returning to revolutionize the technology industry. His obsession with perfection, his refusal to accept mediocrity, and his ability to impose his vision onto reality reflect Nietzschean principles. Musk, on the other hand, embodies the will to power in his drive to push the boundaries of human innovation, whether through Tesla, SpaceX, or Neuralink. His refusal to accept limitations, whether in business, engineering, or space exploration, is precisely the kind of world-shaping ambition that Nietzsche admired. But does this mean that Nietzsche's philosophy is simply about success, ambition, and dominance? Not quite. The will to power is not just about external conquest, it is just as much about inner struggle, about overcoming one's own weaknesses, fears, and self-imposed limitations. Nietzsche believed that the greatest battle is the one we fight within ourselves. The true test of the will to power is not in defeating others, but in constantly refining and improving oneself. This is where his idea of self-overcoming becomes crucial. A person who simply dominates others without striving for self-mastery is not truly exercising the will to power in its highest form. The will to power is not about mere control, it is about transformation, evolution, and the pursuit of excellence. One of the most controversial aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy is his critique of Christianity. Was he correct in calling it a religion of weakness? It is easy to see why Nietzsche made this claim. Christianity, with its emphasis on turning the other cheek, loving one's enemies, and embracing suffering, appears to contradict the principles of strength and power that Nietzsche valued. However, it would be an oversimplification to say that Christianity is purely about submission and weakness. Historically, Christianity has been a force of great cultural and intellectual development, shaping Western civilization in profound ways. Many of its greatest figures, from St. Augustine to Martin Luther, were driven by an intense inner struggle and intellectual power that Nietzsche might have respected. Even the figure of Jesus, though Nietzsche saw him as representing ultimate submission, could be interpreted differently, not as a passive sufferer, but as a revolutionary figure whose ideas overturned the dominant order of his time. If Christianity has survived for over 2,000 years, it is not simply because it promotes weakness, but because it also provides people with meaning, community, and moral structure. Nietzsche, in his radical rejection, may have overlooked the ways in which religious belief can also be an expression of the will to power, particularly when it drives individuals to profound self-overcoming. Psychologically, the will to power has deep implications for how we understand motivation, creativity, and human achievement. Modern psychology, especially in the fields of self-determination theory and existential psychology, echoes many of Nietzsche's insights. The idea that human beings are driven not just by basic survival needs, but by a deeper need to assert themselves, to achieve mastery, and to create meaning aligns with Nietzsche's philosophy. The concept of grit, as studied by psychologists like Angela Duckworth, is essentially a modern expression of the will to power, the ability to persist through challenges and overcome setbacks in pursuit of long-term goals. Similarly, Carl Jung's theory of individuation, the process by which individuals integrate different aspects of themselves to achieve personal wholeness, bears striking similarities to Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming. At its core, the will to power is about refusing to accept the world as it is and instead striving to reshape it according to one's vision. It is a call to reject complacency, to embrace struggle, and to see life as a dynamic process of growth and transformation. Whether in the realm of business, art, politics, or personal development, Nietzsche's concept speaks to that restless drive that pushes individuals beyond their limits. However, it also comes with a warning: unchecked ambition, if not tempered by wisdom and self-awareness, can lead to destruction. History is full of figures whose will to power led them to greatness, but also to ruin. The line between self-overcoming and self-destruction is thin, and Nietzsche's philosophy challenges us to walk that line carefully. In today's world, where many people struggle with meaning, identity, and purpose, the will to power remains an essential idea. It is a reminder that we are not simply victims of fate or circumstance, but agents of our own destiny. Whether through artistic creation, scientific discovery, athletic achievement, or personal development. The will to power urges us to go beyond what is comfortable, to push through obstacles, and to constantly redefine what is possible. Nietzsche's challenge is as relevant today as it was in his time. Will you accept the world as it is, or will you impose your own vision upon it? The Übermensch is one of Nietzsche's most provocative and widely misunderstood ideas. Many people assume it means a kind of superior being, a ruthless dictator, or a justification for domination over others. This is a gross misinterpretation. The Übermensch is not about political power, race, or conquest. It is about self-overcoming, the ability to rise above conventional morality, create one's own values, and live with an intensity and purpose that transcends ordinary human existence. Nietzsche introduced this idea in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, presenting it as an ideal for humanity, a challenge to break free from mediocrity and passive acceptance of societal norms. The Übermensch is the one who writes his own story, who is unafraid to discard inherited beliefs and redefine meaning on his own terms. Traditional morality, particularly in Western thought, has long been shaped by Christian values and Enlightenment ethics, which emphasize humility, equality, and adherence to universal moral laws. Nietzsche saw this as an obstacle to human potential. He argued that morality, rather than being an absolute truth, is a construct one that often suppresses strength, creativity, and individual greatness in favor of conformity. The Übermensch is someone who recognizes that morality is fluid, shaped by historical forces and human needs rather than divine commandments. He does not reject morality entirely, but creates his own values, deciding for himself what is right and wrong based on his own experiences and vision for life. This idea challenges not only religious belief but also modern moral and social structures. Many people today live according to inherited moral codes without questioning them. They follow rules because they are taught to, not because they have deeply examined their beliefs. Nietzsche saw this as a form of intellectual laziness, a refusal to take responsibility for one's own moral framework. The Übermensch, in contrast, is constantly questioning, refining, and evolving his beliefs based on his own internal logic and strength rather than external validation. He does not look to a higher power, a government, or a social movement to tell him what is good. He determines it himself through action, reflection, and experience. The path to becoming an Übermensch is not easy. It requires self-overcoming, which means continually challenging one's limitations, fears, and weaknesses. This is not just about achieving external success, but about inner transformation. Many people settle into comfortable patterns of thought, avoiding discomfort and risk. The Übermensch embraces struggle, seeing it as necessary for growth. Nietzsche believed that true greatness comes from conflict, both within oneself and with the world. Pain, loss, and hardship are not things to be avoided but tools that forge a stronger individual. In a way, Nietzsche's vision is deeply existentialist. It suggests that there is no inherent meaning in life, only the meaning that we create for ourselves through action and experience. A key part of this transformation is the rejection of resentment, a concept Nietzsche called Ressentiment. Many people live with bitterness, blaming others, society, or fate for their shortcomings. The Übermensch does not waste time with resentment. He takes full responsibility for his existence. He does not see himself as a victim, but as the architect of his own reality. This is perhaps one of Nietzsche's most radical challenges to modern psychology and social discourse. Today, much of society encourages victimhood narratives, where people are taught to see themselves as oppressed by external forces. Nietzsche would argue that while injustice and suffering are real, dwelling on them weakens the individual. The path to true power and meaning is not found in blame, but in taking absolute ownership over one's life. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Übermensch is that he is a cruel, immoral dictator. Many people assume that Nietzsche's philosophy leads to a disregard for ethics, a form of nihilism that justifies selfishness or even tyranny. This is a complete misunderstanding. The Übermensch does not reject morality to become a ruthless ruler. He transcends conventional morality to create something higher. He does not follow traditional good and evil, but sets his own ethical code. one that is driven by strength, courage, and creativity. He is not a brute, but a visionary, someone who inspires others rather than enslaves them. Nietzsche admired figures who embodied artistic, intellectual, and philosophical greatness, not those who simply sought power for its own sake. Real-life examples of people who embodied elements of the Übermensch can be found throughout history. Leonardo da Vinci is a perfect example, a man who refused to accept limits, who mastered multiple disciplines, and who was obsessed with the pursuit of knowledge and creation. He did not accept the religious or scientific dogmas of his time, but explored reality on his own terms. He was an artist, an inventor, a scientist, and a philosopher, constantly reinventing himself. His relentless curiosity, independence, and creativity reflect the ideals of the Übermensch. Nietzsche himself, in many ways, was trying to become his own version of the Übermensch. He rejected the religious beliefs of his upbringing, broke away from academia, and pursued a path of solitary intellectual exploration. Despite his illness and suffering, he continued to write, think, and challenge the world until his mind finally collapsed. His life was a testament to his philosophy. He lived and died by his own rules, refusing to conform to society's expectations. The modern world is filled with opportunities and challenges that make Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch more relevant than ever. Today's society is often characterized by passivity, where people wait for meaning to be given to them rather than creating it themselves. Many individuals seek external validation through social media, career success, or ideological movements rather than cultivating inner strength and autonomy. Nietzsche would argue that to truly thrive, one must stop seeking approval from the crowd and instead build a unique and self-determined life. The Übermensch is not a fantasy or an impossible ideal, it is a challenge. It is a call to break free from mediocrity, to think deeply, to create rather than consume, to rise above fear and self-doubt. It is about becoming a person who is so in control of their own existence that they need no validation from the world. It is about creating your own meaning, rather than waiting for someone else to define it for you. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence is one of the most mind-bending ideas in philosophy, a thought experiment designed to shake people out of complacency. Imagine that every single moment of your life, every decision, every failure, every joy, and every regret would repeat endlessly, exactly the same, forever, not just once or twice, but an infinite number of times. Every conversation, every heartbreak, every missed opportunity would come back in an unbreakable cycle. Would you be able to accept this? Would you scream in horror at the idea? Or would you embrace it fully, living in such a way that you could say yes to life, no matter what? The power of this concept is not in whether it is literally true, but in how it forces us to confront the way we live. If you knew that your life would be on repeat forever, would you keep making the same choices? Would you continue in a job you hate, stay in toxic relationships, or let fear dictate your actions? Nietzsche presents eternal recurrence as the ultimate test of self-acceptance and responsibility. If you recoil at the idea of reliving your life exactly as it is, then something needs to change. It is an inescapable mirror that reflects whether you are truly living authentically or simply drifting through existence. This idea dismantles the way people often think about life. Most of us go through life imagining that we are moving towards some final destination, some ultimate reward or resolution. Many believe in an afterlife, reincarnation, or cosmic justice that will fix things in the end. Eternal recurrence destroys that illusion. It tells us that there is no grand finale, no escape, no external meaning beyond what we create. It forces the terrifying realization that this is it, this life, these choices, this existence is all there is, and it will be yours forever. The psychological effects of this realization can be profound. Many people live haunted by regret, stuck in the past, wishing they had done things differently. Eternal recurrence challenges that by forcing you to see that every moment, even the painful ones, are necessary. Every failure, every wrong turn, every heartbreak becomes a part of the grand cycle, something you must accept if you are to affirm your life fully. Instead of seeing mistakes as things to be erased, They become essential threads in the tapestry of your existence. This shifts the focus from dwelling on what went wrong to owning every part of your story. This concept also transforms the way we see success and happiness. If life is just a one-time journey with a definite endpoint, then many people chase success as if it were a final goal. They work endless hours to achieve status, money, or recognition, believing that once they arrive, they will be satisfied. But if life repeats endlessly, then success is not a finish line, it is just another part of the cycle. The real question is, are you living in a way that you would be content to repeat forever? Would you work the same job, love the same people, spend your time the same way? If not, then the pursuit of external success is meaningless. You need to focus on creating a life that is intrinsically worth living. This idea has parallels in other philosophies and religions, but Nietzsche's version is uniquely brutal and direct. In Buddhism, the cycle of rebirth samsara is seen as something to escape through enlightenment. Life's repetition is viewed as a burden, and the goal is to break free from the cycle entirely. In Stoicism, the idea of accepting fate amor fati aligns somewhat with eternal recurrence, but the Stoics focused more on mental detachment, whereas Nietzsche demands full immersion in life. The difference is that while many philosophies offer an ultimate escape, whether through nirvana, heaven, or an enlightened state, eternal recurrence gives no such comfort. It is total responsibility, total affirmation, total acceptance. The question then becomes, how can we apply eternal recurrence in daily life? The simplest way is to ask yourself, if I had to relive this day forever, would I be satisfied with how I spent it? If the answer is no, that is a clear signal that something needs to change. It forces people to stop postponing their dreams, stop wasting time on things that do not matter, and start living deliberately. Procrastination disappears because there is no later, there is only this moment. Repeating forever. This perspective can be incredibly freeing. Instead of obsessing over external achievements, you focus on making each moment meaningful in itself, rather than as a means to an end. Imagine two people. One spends their life stuck in a job they hate, waiting for retirement, enduring a passionless routine because they believe that eventually they will get to enjoy life. The other lives fully in each moment, pursuing work they care about, engaging deeply with people, and making choices that resonate with their values. Under eternal recurrence, the first person is trapped in an endless cycle of dissatisfaction, while the second person is living in a way that they could accept forever. This is the ultimate test of how well you are living. Many people might feel overwhelmed by this idea. The thought of repeating their life forever might seem terrifying, especially if they are currently unhappy. But Nietzsche does not present this idea as a punishment, he presents it as a challenge. If the idea of eternal repetition is unbearable, then something is deeply wrong, and it is up to you to change it. The burden is immense, but so is the power. You are not just a passive observer in life, you are its creator. Every choice matters, not because of some external reward, but because it shapes the very fabric of your existence. The lesson of eternal recurrence is simple but profound. Live in such a way that you could say yes to your life, not just once, but an infinite number of times. Stop waiting for meaning to come from outside. Stop thinking happiness is something you will find later. Stop making choices that do not align with who you truly want to be. Because if Nietzsche is right, you will be making those choices forever. Nietzsche's famous declaration, "God is dead," is one of the most misunderstood statements in all of philosophy. Many assume it is a simple attack on religion, a celebration of atheism, or a call for the rejection of spirituality. But Nietzsche was not just making a statement about belief in God, he was describing a seismic shift in human civilization, a moment of crisis where the foundation of meaning, morality, and purpose was collapsing. He was not saying that God literally died, but that belief in a divine moral order had become unsustainable. Science, secularism, and modern thought had eroded faith, and people could no longer rely on religion to give life meaning. This, for Nietzsche, was both liberating and terrifying, because if the moral structures built around God were falling apart, what would replace them? If there was no divine law, no heaven, no cosmic justice, then where could humanity turn for meaning? This collapse of religious values led to what Nietzsche saw as the great existential crisis of the modern world. For centuries, religion provided a framework for human existence. It told people what was good and evil, why they were here, and what would happen after death. Even for those who did not strictly follow religious teachings, the cultural foundations of morality were built on these ideas. But when faith in these structures began to crumble, many were left adrift, lost, and uncertain about what to believe. The old values were gone, but no new values had replaced them. This is where nihilism enters the picture, the belief that life has no meaning, no purpose, no inherent value. Nihilism, for Nietzsche, was not just a philosophical position, it was a psychological state, a deep existential emptiness that could consume individuals and entire societies. When people lose faith in traditional morality but have nothing to replace it with, they risk falling into despair, apathy, or destructive impulses. Some try to distract themselves with entertainment, material success, or empty pleasures, but these do not provide real meaning. Others turn to political ideologies or extreme movements, hoping to find a substitute for lost religious certainty, and some simply break down, overcome by depression, anxiety, and the crushing realization that life offers no built-in purpose. This, Nietzsche feared, was the fate of modern humanity, a world without faith, but also without direction. The dark side of nihilism is not just personal despair, it is also the potential for dangerous ideologies to emerge. Nietzsche saw that when people lose meaning, they often become desperate to create new absolutes. This is how mass political movements, totalitarian regimes, and fanatical ideologies gain power. When traditional religion weakens, people often turn to ideological substitutes, whether nationalism, communism, fascism, or radical political belief systems to fill the void. These new belief systems often function like religions, offering a simplistic view of good and evil, a clear enemy to blame, and a promise of salvation. The 20th century proved Nietzsche right. Totalitarian movements like Nazism and Soviet communism became new, secular religions that demanded absolute loyalty, turning ideological belief into a replacement for God. Millions died as a result. But Nietzsche did not believe that falling into nihilism was inevitable. He saw nihilism as a challenge to be overcome, not a final destination. The mistake, he warned, was to replace the old religious values with new dogmas, rather than creating new values from within. The answer was not to fall back into blind faith, nor to surrender to meaninglessness, but to rise above both. He believed that the strongest individuals, the ones who could face reality without illusions, had the opportunity to become creators of meaning, to define their own purpose rather than relying on inherited beliefs. This is where Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming comes in. Instead of looking for external sources of meaning, whether in religion, ideology, or social validation, he argued that people must create their own values through personal strength, creativity, and engagement with life. Meaning is not something given, it is something built. This is a radical departure from both religious thinking and passive nihilism. Instead of waiting for meaning to be revealed or mourning its absence, the individual must act, strive, and impose meaning onto existence. Life has no inherent purpose, but that is not a curse, it is an opportunity. It means we are free to define our purpose, free to shape our own morality, free to live by our own highest standards. This rejection of nihilism without falling into blind optimism is one of Nietzsche's most powerful insights. Many people, when faced with the idea that life has no inherent meaning, either fall into despair or try to invent comforting illusions. Nietzsche saw both as weak responses. He rejected false hope, the idea that meaning could be restored by simply pretending that old beliefs were still valid. But he also rejected hopelessness, arguing that life can still be deeply fulfilling, creative, and powerful, but only if we take responsibility for shaping it ourselves. He challenged people to face reality without illusions and still affirm life. This idea is immensely relevant today. Many modern societies have moved away from traditional religion, but this has not necessarily led to greater happiness or fulfillment. Instead, many people experience a deep existential void. struggling to find meaning in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. Some retreat into consumerism, social media, or shallow distractions, trying to numb the emptiness. Others become obsessed with ideologies, treating politics, activism, or identity as new religious absolutes. But neither of these approaches truly solves the problem, they only mask it. Nietzsche's challenge remains: can you create meaning for yourself? Can you live in a way that does not rely on external validation, divine purpose, or inherited beliefs? Can you affirm life, even in the face of uncertainty? The key is personal transformation. Nietzsche believed that overcoming nihilism requires a complete shift in how we approach life. Instead of seeing existence as something to be explained, justified, or redeemed, he argued that we must embrace life as an artistic project, something to be actively shaped and experienced. This means embracing struggle, accepting suffering, and seeing challenges as opportunities for growth rather than as signs that life is unfair. It means rejecting passive acceptance and instead becoming a creator, whether through art, philosophy, leadership, or personal development. It means living with intensity, engaging with life fully, and refusing to settle for mediocrity. This is not easy. Nietzsche never promised that overcoming nihilism would be comfortable. It requires a kind of radical honesty, the ability to look at existence without illusions and still say yes. But for those who can do it, the reward is enormous. Instead of feeling lost, they become self-directed. Instead of seeking external meaning, they create their own. Instead of fearing the loss of old values, they revel in the freedom to build something new. This, Nietzsche believed, is the path to true strength, the ability to face a world without inherent meaning and still love life. The challenge he leaves us with is immense but liberating. In a world where the old gods are gone, where traditional structures no longer provide easy answers, we are left with a choice. We can fall into despair, searching endlessly for meaning that will not come. We can cling to false certainties, pretending that old beliefs still hold. Or we can embrace the uncertainty, take responsibility for our own existence, and create meaning through our actions, our choices, and our strength. This is the essence of Nietzsche's philosophy: not despair, not blind faith, but a courageous affirmation of life itself. Nietzsche's view on truth, power, and morality is one of his most radical ideas and remains as relevant today as it was in his time. He did not see truth as something objective or absolute, but rather as something created, shaped, and manipulated by those in power. He argued that what we call truth is often just a perspective, a narrative that serves the interests of a particular group, class, or ideology. This was not just a critique of religion or traditional morality, but of all systems of belief, including science, politics, and culture. For Nietzsche, truth is not something that exists independently in some divine or rational order, but is a tool used to structure society and control human behavior. The idea that power shapes truth is one of Nietzsche's most profound insights, and we see it play out everywhere in the modern world. Governments, corporations, media outlets, and ideological movements all claim to be the bearers of truth, but in reality, they are shaping narratives that serve their interests. The way we understand history, morality, justice, and even science is deeply influenced by those who control information. Nietzsche would argue that most people do not seek truth, they seek confirmation of their beliefs, validation of their worldview, and reassurance that the structures they rely on are legitimate. Power does not just influence what is considered true, it defines reality itself. Nowhere is this more evident than in the way media and politics shape public perception. News outlets, whether left or right, do not simply report facts, they frame stories, omit details, and highlight certain perspectives to fit a particular ideological stance. Social media algorithms do not show objective truths, they amplify emotionally charged content that increases engagement, regardless of its accuracy. Political leaders do not govern based on universal principles, they create narratives that justify their power and demonize opposition. Nietzsche saw this long before the rise of modern media, recognizing that those who control the language of discourse ultimately control what is seen as moral, just, or acceptable. This is why history is constantly rewritten, why heroes and villains change depending on who tells the story, and why truth is never as stable as people like to believe. This ties directly into Nietzsche's distinction between slave morality and master morality. He argued that society is structured to promote weakness, obedience, and conformity, rather than strength, independence, and self-overcoming. Slave morality, which dominates modern culture, is based on the values of the weak: humility, equality, submission, and victimhood. It glorifies suffering, turns resentment into virtue, and teaches people to seek security rather than power. Christianity, socialism, and many modern political movements, according to Nietzsche, encourage this mentality by making people believe that virtue is found in weakness, and that power is evil. This allows those in control to maintain their dominance because people have been conditioned to accept submission as moral. Master morality, on the other hand, is based on the values of the strong: courage, ambition, creativity, and the willingness to impose one's will on the world. It does not seek external validation or moral approval, but creates its own standards of right and wrong. Master morality is not about cruelty or oppression. It is about asserting one's power and embracing life fully, rather than shrinking from it. Nietzsche saw great leaders, artists, and thinkers as examples of this mindset: people who refuse to be defined by societal norms and instead carve their own path. He did not believe that all people were capable of this level of self-overcoming, but he saw it as the ideal for those strong enough to pursue it. The problem, however, is that modern societies are built to discourage master morality. Instead of rewarding strength, they punish it. Instead of encouraging independence, they demand conformity. Instead of embracing the reality of power, they demonize ambition and competition. Nietzsche would likely see today's culture of hypersensitivity, political correctness, and moral outrage as a continuation of slave morality, a system that keeps people focused on grievances rather than greatness. The rise of victimhood culture, where status is determined by how oppressed one claims to be rather than by achievement, is exactly the kind of moral inversion he warned about. In such a system, strength is seen as a threat, and weakness is glorified as virtue. This has had enormous implications for modern propaganda, political manipulation, and psychological control. Governments and corporations have mastered the art of controlling public perception by exploiting the principles Nietzsche identified. They do not rule through brute force alone, but by shaping morality, controlling narratives, and redefining what is considered good and evil. The most effective power is the kind that makes people internalize their own subjugation, where they willingly accept limitations because they believe it is the right thing to do. Look at how authoritarian regimes operate. They do not just suppress dissent physically, they control language, rewrite history, and reshape cultural values to make people believe in their own oppression. In Orwellian fashion, they convince citizens that slavery is freedom, that ignorance is strength, and that questioning authority is immoral. The most successful forms of control do not require force, they create a moral system that justifies submission. Nietzsche saw this happening in his time with Christianity and state power, and it has only intensified in the modern era. Even in so-called free societies, we see similar mechanisms at work. The way corporations manipulate consumer behavior, the way social movements dictate acceptable speech, the way political parties manufacture outrage, all of this reflects Nietzsche's insight that power is not just about laws or military force, but about controlling how people think. The most dangerous aspect of this is that most people do not realize they are being controlled. They genuinely believe they are acting according to their own values, when in reality, those values have been pre-selected and conditioned by external forces. Some of the most extreme examples of this can be found in totalitarian states like North Korea, where the government has created an entire mythology around its leaders, making them appear godlike. Citizens are not just forced to obey, they are taught to love their subjugation, to see it as morally righteous. Even in democratic nations, we see softer versions of this. People are taught to view political opponents as evil, to believe that their government's actions are always morally justified, and to accept restrictions on their freedom in the name of security or justice. Nietzsche's critique of society was not just about pointing out these mechanisms of control, it was about challenging individuals to break free from them. He did not believe in passive resistance or idealistic revolutions. He believed in self-overcoming, in becoming strong enough to resist manipulation and create one's own values. This is why his work remains so powerful today. He does not offer comforting illusions, he offers a brutal but liberating truth. The world is a battlefield of competing wills, and those who do not assert their own will are destined to be controlled by those who do. The challenge he presents is a difficult one. Most people do not want to accept that truth is fluid, that morality is a construct, or that power is the real force behind human affairs. It is easier to believe in objective good and evil, in absolute justice, in a world that is fair and orderly. But Nietzsche's greatest insight is that such illusions are dangerous because they make people complacent. They blind individuals to the realities of power and keep them trapped in a morality designed to weaken them rather than strengthen them. The lesson from all of this is clear. If you do not define your own values, someone else will define them for you. If you do not take control of your own perspective, someone else will shape it for you. If you do not assert your own power, you will be ruled by those who do. Nietzsche's philosophy is not about abandoning morality, it is about creating your own morality, one that is based on strength, awareness, and the courage to face reality without illusion. The question is whether people are willing to accept this challenge, or whether they will continue to live under a system designed to keep them weak. Nietzsche's final years are one of the most tragic yet paradoxical chapters in the history of philosophy. The man who spent his life preaching self-overcoming, strength, and intellectual independence ultimately succumbed to madness, disappearing into a decade-long mental fog from which he would never return. His ideas, once dismissed and ignored, became widely influential only after he lost his ability to engage with them. This cruel irony where a thinker's mind collapses just as his philosophy is on the verge of greatness has fascinated and haunted scholars for over a century. What caused Nietzsche's breakdown? Was it syphilis, a genetic disorder, or the sheer weight of his own intellectual burden? And more importantly, what can his downfall teach us about the dangers of genius, obsession, and the limits of the human mind? The story of Nietzsche's decline begins in the late 1880s. By this point, he was living in near total isolation, having severed ties with almost all his former friends and colleagues. His relationships with Richard Wagner and Lou Salome, two of the most significant figures in his life, had ended in bitter disappointment. His health, always fragile, had deteriorated, even further crippling migraines, violent nausea, and extreme sensitivity to light had become his daily reality. He wandered across Europe, moving between small towns in Switzerland, Italy, and Germany, searching for relief from his ailments. He lived in modest boarding houses, spending his days in solitude, writing feverishly as if racing against time. Then, in early 1889, something inside Nietzsche snapped. He was in Turin, Italy, when he suffered a complete mental collapse. The most famous incident, whether fact or legend, describes him witnessing a horse being whipped in the street. Overcome with emotion, he reportedly threw his arms around the horse's neck and broke down in tears. From that moment, Nietzsche was no longer himself. He began writing bizarre letters, later known as the Madness Letters, in which he signed off as Dionysus or the Crucified. In these final communications before being institutionalized, he declared himself the ruler of the world, sent cryptic messages to former friends and enemies, and made grandiose, prophetic statements about his own work. His writing became increasingly disconnected from reality. One moment, he seemed to believe he was a divine figure, sent to redeem humanity. The next, he expressed delusions of grandeur, claiming that his philosophy had already reshaped civilization. His family and friends, horrified, had him forcibly taken back to Germany, where he was institutionalized. From that point on, Nietzsche was no longer lucid. He lived for another 11 years, but his mind had completely deteriorated. He spent his last decade in a semi-vegetative state, cared for by his mother and, after her death, his sister, who exploited his name and distorted his work for her own political purposes. The cause of Nietzsche's breakdown remains one of the great medical mysteries in philosophy. For years, the most widely accepted theory was that he suffered from tertiary syphilis, a late-stage neurological condition that causes progressive brain damage and madness. The symptoms of confusion, paranoia, megalomania, and motor dysfunction all seem to align with this diagnosis. However, more recent research has challenged this explanation. Some scholars argue that Nietzsche showed signs of a genetic disorder, possibly frontotemporal dementia, which can cause personality changes, erratic behavior, and cognitive decline. Others suggest that his breakdown was not caused by disease at all, but by the sheer psychological stress of his own ideas, his radical rejection of traditional beliefs, his intellectual solitude, and his relentless pursuit of philosophical extremes may have pushed his mind beyond its breaking point. His final writings are some of the most haunting and prophetic in the history of philosophy. In his last completed books, Ecce Homo and Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche wrote about himself with a kind of delusional confidence, as if he were a historical prophet who had finally reached the pinnacle of human understanding. He described himself as the greatest mind in history, claimed that his books would change the world, and spoke of his ideas as if they were divine revelations. But behind this bravado, there is also a sense of deep loneliness and desperation. He knew he was running out of time. He knew his health was failing. He feared obscurity, that his work would disappear, that his ideas would be lost before they could make an impact. And in an ironic twist, it was only after he lost his mind that the world finally started to take notice. The tragic paradox of Nietzsche's collapse is that his philosophy became famous precisely because of his madness. Before 1889, he was an obscure thinker, largely ignored by the academic world. After his breakdown, his books were reprinted, his ideas were debated, and his status as a tormented genius gave his work an almost mythical aura. His sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, played a major role in shaping his posthumous reputation, but she also manipulated and distorted his ideas. She aligned herself with far-right political movements, selectively edited Nietzsche's writings, and made it seem as though he supported German nationalism and anti-Semitism, despite the fact that he had explicitly opposed both. This misrepresentation led to Nietzsche being falsely associated with the ideology of the Nazi regime decades later, a perversion of his work that he was never able to defend against. What can Nietzsche's downfall teach us about genius, mental health, and the dangers of philosophical obsession? One of the most striking lessons is that great intellectual power does not make one immune to personal destruction. Nietzsche was one of the most brilliant minds of his era, but his relentless pursuit of truth and meaning may have contributed to his collapse. His philosophy was not just an academic exercise, he lived it, embodied it, and pushed himself to the absolute extreme. Unlike other thinkers who engaged in detached speculation, Nietzsche took his ideas personally. He saw philosophy not as an abstract discipline, but as a matter of life and death. This intensity, while the source of his genius, may have also been his undoing. His story also highlights the psychological dangers of extreme isolation and intellectual radicalism. Nietzsche cut himself off from nearly everyone who once supported him. He burned bridges, lived in solitude, and rejected almost all social connections. While solitude can be a source of strength for deep thinkers, too much of it can lead to psychological collapse. Without external checks, without relationships to ground him, Nietzsche's mind became trapped in its own echo chamber, spiraling further and further into extremes. This is a warning for those who believe that pure reason, unchecked, is enough to sustain a person. Human beings are social creatures, and even the greatest minds need connection, dialogue, and external reality checks to stay balanced. Nietzsche's tragic end also raises uncomfortable questions about the price of genius. Many of history's greatest minds, Van Gogh, Tesla, Beethoven, and even modern figures like Steve Jobs, displayed signs of extreme obsession, isolation, and psychological turmoil. There seems to be a fine line between intellectual brilliance and personal destruction. Nietzsche crossed that line, pushing himself so far that his own mind turned against him. His story forces us to ask, is greatness worth the price of madness? Can someone truly dedicate themselves fully to their work, their vision, and their philosophy without it eventually consuming them? In the end, Nietzsche's ideas outlived him, but his life remains a haunting reminder of what happens when someone pushes beyond the limits of the human mind. His breakdown was not just a medical event, it was the final act of a man who had spent his life challenging everything, only to be overwhelmed by his own conclusions. Whether he was broken by illness, loneliness, or the sheer weight of his ideas, his fate stands as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder of the immense power of philosophy and the dangerous abyss that awaits those who dare to stare too deeply into the void. Nietzsche's legacy is one of the most controversial, transformative, and misunderstood in the history of philosophy. His ideas shaped existentialism, postmodernism, psychology, and even modern discussions on power, truth, and human nature. Yet, his work has also been misinterpreted, distorted, and weaponized in ways he could have never predicted. The very man who warned about the dangers of ideology became a victim of it, as his ideas were twisted into forms that he likely would have despised. The biggest question that lingers over Nietzsche's work is whether his philosophy represents a dangerous vision that leads to destruction or the ultimate truth that forces humanity to evolve. His influence has only grown over time, and in today's hyper-individualistic, uncertain world, his ideas feel more relevant than ever. But can we engage with Nietzsche's philosophy without falling into arrogance, nihilism, or the traps of misinterpretation? If Nietzsche were alive today, what would he say to us? Would he be horrified by how his ideas have been used? Or would he see himself as the ultimate prophet of the modern age? The most undeniable part of Nietzsche's legacy is how deeply he influenced existentialist and postmodernist thought. Without him, there would be no Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, or Martin Heidegger. The entire framework of existentialism, the idea that life has no inherent meaning and that individuals must create their own values, comes directly from Nietzsche's rejection of traditional morality and objective truth. His critique of unquestioned authority, herd mentality, and the illusion of absolute moral systems laid the groundwork for postmodernism, which challenges the idea that there is one fixed, universal way to interpret reality. His work also influenced psychologists like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, who explored the depths of the human psyche, the unconscious, and the darker aspects of human nature in ways that Nietzsche had already foreshadowed. His concept of the will to power can even be seen in modern self-help culture, the idea that strength comes from struggle, and that overcoming oneself is the highest form of achievement, is now deeply embedded in motivational philosophy. Yet, despite or perhaps because of his immense influence, Nietzsche's work has been dangerously misinterpreted, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. The most infamous case is how the Nazis twisted his philosophy to justify their ideology of racial superiority, despite the fact that Nietzsche detested nationalism, anti-Semitism, and any form of herd mentality. His idea of the Übermensch was not about one race or group being superior to another, it was about self-overcoming, personal excellence, and breaking free from imposed moralities. The Nazis, however, selectively edited his writings, especially under the influence of his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, who was a Nazi sympathizer, and used them to support their fascist ideology. They stripped Nietzsche's philosophy of its individualistic and intellectual nature, turning it into a justification for totalitarian control. This remains one of the greatest tragedies of his posthumous reputation, as even today, many people wrongly associate Nietzsche with dangerous, authoritarian ideas that he would have despised. But this misinterpretation is not limited to history. Even in modern times, Nietzsche's philosophy is often misunderstood or misapplied, particularly in an era where hyper-individualism and cultural fragmentation dominate. We live in a time where people are increasingly encouraged to define their own truths, reject tradition, and embrace self-creation, all ideas that echo Nietzsche's philosophy. But does this mean society is moving toward Nietzsche's vision? Or has it taken his ideas in an unintended direction? Nietzsche warned about nihilism, the risk that without absolute truths, people might fall into despair, meaninglessness, or extreme self-interest. And looking at today's world, we can see both the positive and negative sides of his influence. On one hand, modern individualism has allowed people to break free from rigid social and religious structures, explore new ideas, and embrace personal freedom like never before. But on the other hand, it has also led to a crisis of meaning, where many struggle with loneliness, anxiety, and the feeling that life has no purpose beyond self-gratification. The danger of falling into arrogance or nihilism when engaging with Nietzsche's philosophy is real. Many people read Nietzsche and interpret his ideas as an excuse to reject all morality, to become purely self-serving, or to look down on those who still believe in traditional values. This is not what Nietzsche intended. The Übermensch is not a narcissist or an egomaniac. He is someone who creates meaning through excellence, through mastery, through self-transcendence. The will to power is not about oppressing others, but about overcoming oneself. If taken the wrong way, Nietzsche's philosophy can lead to cold detachment, cynicism, and elitism, the belief that one is superior simply because they reject conventional beliefs. But if taken correctly, it is a philosophy of life affirmation, personal growth, and creative self-expression. So, how do we engage with Nietzsche's ideas without falling into these traps? The key is to understand that his philosophy is not a doctrine, but a challenge. Nietzsche does not give easy answers or universal truths. He forces individuals to think for themselves, question everything, and take full responsibility for their existence. He does not tell people what to believe, but instead forces them to examine why they believe what they do. This is why his work remains so powerful. It does not provide comfort, but it provides clarity. It strips away illusions and forces individuals to confront themselves, to decide who they want to be, what values they will create, and how they will shape their own destiny. If Nietzsche were alive today, what would he say to us? He would likely see the same patterns he warned about in his time: mass conformity, ideological fanaticism, and people desperately searching for meaning in external sources rather than creating it for themselves. He would likely criticize social media culture, where people chase validation rather than self-mastery. He would likely mock the modern obsession with identity politics, seeing it as another form of herd mentality. He would likely call out both the nihilists who believe in nothing and the moralists who impose rigid ideological systems in the name of progress. And above all, he would likely laugh at how misunderstood his own work has become, seeing it as proof of how few people are willing to do the hard work of true philosophical reflection. Nietzsche's legacy is neither purely dangerous nor purely liberating. It is both. His ideas are powerful, and power can be used for creation or destruction, for enlightenment or manipulation. His philosophy demands intellectual courage, the willingness to embrace uncertainty, to reject easy answers, and to take control of one's own life. But it also comes with responsibility, the recognition that without discipline, without depth, without self-awareness, Nietzsche's ideas can easily be twisted into something toxic. The final lesson of Nietzsche is this: you are responsible for your own existence. No one will give you meaning, no one will save you, and no one will dictate your purpose unless you allow them to. You can choose to accept inherited beliefs, or you can create your own values. You can choose to follow the crowd, or you can rise above it. You can live passively, or you can impose your own will on life. But whatever you choose, know that it is you who chooses, and in that choice, your fate is decided. Nietzsche was not a prophet. He did not give us a grand system of belief, a final answer, or a comforting vision of the future. He did something far more terrifying. He tore down every illusion we cling to and left us with nothing but ourselves. He warned us that without God, without an external source of meaning, the modern world would fall into nihilism, an age where people either descend into despair or grasp at artificial beliefs to fill the void. Look around. Was he wrong? But Nietzsche was not a nihilist. He did not believe that life was meaningless. He believed that meaning is something we must create for ourselves. The Übermensch was not a tyrant or a dictator. He was the one who rises above the herd, who refuses to be shackled by inherited values, who takes responsibility for their own existence. The will to power is not about domination over others, but domination over yourself, your fears, your weaknesses, your doubts. The real question is, Are you ready to live like this? If you knew your life would repeat forever, would you be proud of the way you are living it? If everything you believe in was shattered, would you have the strength to forge your own path? If all morality was exposed as an illusion, would you have the courage to define your own values? Most people will never ask these questions. Most will follow the crowd, accept the narratives they are given, live passively, and call it a life. But if you've made it to the end of this video, you're not most people. Nietzsche's challenge is now your challenge. Will you ignore it? Or will you take the first step toward becoming something greater? Let's keep this conversation going. Drop a comment below. What do you think about Nietzsche's ideas? Do they inspire you, or do they terrify you? I want to hear your thoughts. If you found this video thought-provoking, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to support deep, intellectual content like this, consider dropping a super thanks or donating to help us keep making high-quality philosophy videos. And don't forget to subscribe, because there is so much more to uncover in the world of dangerous ideas and revolutionary thinkers. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and never stop creating your own meaning.